All right, so yes, to set some context, the Japanese occupation was from 1942 to 1945. It ended when World War II ended. Okay, and World War II ended when the United States of America, they dropped 2 atomic bombs, or what we know today as nuclear weapons, on Japan. Okay, and these nuclear weapons are given very interesting names. They're called Little Boy and Fat Man. Okay, and so the US drops them on 2 cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, and between these 2 blasts, 200,000 people die from just 2 bombs. So as a result of that destruction, Japan realizes that they cannot win the war against America anymore, and they surrender. And so that ends War II, and that ends the Japanese occupation. Okay, this is actually a picture of the blast radius of Fat Man superimposed over BT Secondary School. So this is what happens if somehow in the future an atomic weapon drops on BT Secondary School. Okay, and you can see that the destruction that is caused is really quite a lot lah. Like it will like knock out almost the entire of Bishan and Toa Payoh. Okay, and this is not even the most powerful nuclear weapon that man has ever produced. So this just shows the power of the atomic weapon that was dropped upon Japan. And so as a result, what happens is that the British return to Singapore in August 1945, and they established the British Military Administration. A victory parade was held for the returning British, and the crowd was cheering lah. But the question that I want to begin is, do you think the locals welcome Japanese rule, British rule? Do you think they were as accepting, as supportive of British rule compared to before the Japanese occupation? Okay, so think about it. Well, the answer is they were not. Most of the locals were beginning to realize that British rule was not the natural way of things. And many more people were beginning to reject and oppose British rule. Okay, so the first point that we want to cover today is what were the factors that influenced that response towards British rule? What changed, right? What happened during the Japanese occupation and immediately after the Japanese occupation that caused different people within Singapore to reject British rule from coming back and to begin to demand for their own independence? I think that's something that you all discovered when you all played the Deck Toy Maze activity, right? You all remember the quote from Lee Kuan Yew saying that we realized that we can govern ourselves. Okay, what were the factors that influenced that response, or those thoughts and beliefs that were beginning to take root within Singapore? So the first thing, and you all can now refer to your notes for this, right, is that there were internal developments that were happening. Okay, internal developments. By the way, these are all in your worksheet already in your class notebook. So do fill in the blanks. There are some blanks that need to be filled in. Okay, so we're looking at internal development, which is development within Singapore. And one of the internal development is the Japanese occupation, right? And how the Japanese occupation actually dispelled what we call the myth of white man's superiority. Okay, white men referring to Westerners, referring to the Europeans. Okay, before the war, there was a belief that Europeans and Westerners were superior. But the Japanese occupation dispelled that myth. And it led to an increase in what we call nationalism, which is the belief that your territory that you're in should become an independent and sovereign nation. So what was the impact of the Japanese occupation? Well, it proved to many Asians that they are more capable, right, than the Europeans, and they should be able to govern themselves. During the Japanese occupation, many Asians also got experience leading and governing a country. So for example, you see the picture of a pretty handsome man, the first Prime Minister of Indonesia, Sukarno. Okay, and Sukarno basically gained experience during the Japanese occupation because he collaborated, right? That's linked to our WWII. He collaborated with the Japanese and he gained experience. Okay. So in many ways, the Japanese occupation was a turning point in Southeast Asian nationalism, in a sense that before the Japanese occupation, there was no nationalism, or there was very little. But after the Japanese occupation, suddenly it's a 180-degree turnaround. And suddenly so many people were beginning to want their own independence from colonial masters. Okay, so that's the internal development that influence the response. The external development is the weakening of colonial rule in other countries, okay, in other Asian countries. And here you can write it down in your notes also. There's a Pew table provided for you. Basically, during the Japanese occupation, these anti-colonial feelings begin to grow in many Southeast Asian countries. And when the Japanese surrendered, many people then saw that the chance had come to rise up against the European colonial rulers. So, okay, I'm just going to show some pictures and then you'll let me know who they are. Okay, you can type in chat. Who is this person? Anyone knows? You can unmute or you can type it on chat. Who is this man that we see over here? Anyone knows him? Wei Long says Indian man. What are you talking about? Ashika is right. Okay, this is Gandhi. And where is Gandhi from? It's from India. Okay, Gandhi is basically the famous leader that fought for India's independence from the British. Okay, yep, thanks Amira. It's Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, and he was the one that led a non-violent rebellion against the British rule in India. Anyone recognizes this man? It's a bit more difficult to recognize. 5 points to anyone who can tell me his name. Anyone knows who he is? Yes, Liu Tian. Okay, this is Ho Chi Minh. Okay, by the way, please don't spam the chat, Damien. I'll just kick you out, okay? Okay, this is Ho Chi Minh. Where's Ho Chi Minh from? He's from Vietnam. He's the man that led Vietnam in a war against the French. Okay, that's right. So these are the examples, okay, of all the Asian countries that gained independence immediately after the Japanese occupation. Okay, so please write them down. And I'll just give us like 30 seconds to write them down and I'll just talk over the slides, okay? So the first example is India that gained independence from the British in 1947. Then 2 years later, Indonesia gained independence from the Dutch. And I put the description there, violent. This was a violent revolution. It was actually a war between Indonesians and the Dutch, right? In 1954, Vietnam gained independence from the French. Again, this is a violent revolution. They fought a war against the French. Okay, and Vietnam is a unique case because Vietnam would then fight another war against another Western power in the 1960s. Okay, and who's that Western power? I think some of us might know. Okay, we'll learn about it next year, or when you take history like next year. The Vietnam War. Thanks, Sharat. Okay, and that's against the United States of America. So Vietnam is a very unique country in Southeast Asia in the sense that it actually won a war against two Western countries. Okay, quite significant. So all around Southeast Asia and Asia, we see people beginning to break away from colonialism. Okay, you can write it down first. Keep see your annotation. Okay. Now, what would the impact of all these rebellions and revolutions be in Singapore? Imagine you are somebody who is in Singapore at that time, and you hear news around you that different Asian countries are slowly getting their independence. What will your response be? The response will be, why not me? That's right, Wei Long, to follow them. Okay? Because it's like you got hope lah. Before that, you didn't think that it's possible that Asian countries can successfully rebel. But you see examples of even Indonesia and Vietnam, who are supposedly like not very militarily strong, but they win a war against two Western countries. So you're encouraged and you have hope. Okay. And these are pictures demonstrating these violent wars. Okay. The first one is the Indonesian National Revolution. This is a 4-year war. Okay. And even now, only recently did the Dutch really apologize for that very violent war that took place. Okay. And this is the second war, the French-Vietnam War in 1946 to 1954. Right? So as a result of this, colonial rule in Asia appeared to be weakening. Okay. So locals in Singapore were beginning to be encouraged by these external developments, and they wanted to see the same changes. And therefore, people were increasingly influenced to reject British rule and fight for their own independence. Okay, so these examples or these basically like success stories around the world gave them hope. Okay, gave locals in Singapore hope and inspired them to begin to fight for their own independence. Okay, so that's the first external development, okay, which is the growing or the weakening of colonial rule in other Asian countries. The second development is the growing influence of communism. Okay, again, if you're very interested in communism, I encourage you to take history next year and you learn more about it. So we won't go into the details of what communism is. You don't have to know, you don't have to write about it in your exams. You just need to know, I'll tell you what you need to know about communism later on. Basically, communism originated from this place called the Soviet Union. Okay, and an Asian country, China, also becomes communist in 1949. And communism was particularly attractive because it opposed colonial rule for its exploitation of people. See, communism, right, they are very against this idea of exploitation. They believe that in society, there are many different classes of people. And the higher class, more rich people are oppressing. What does oppress mean? It means you push them down. They are oppressing and pushing down the lower class. And they are basically using the lower class for their own gain. That's one of the ideas of communism, which therefore meant that by definition, communists would reject colonial rule because colonial rule is where Western countries use the Asian countries, extract their resources for their own personal gain. Okay, so just a brief introduction to what communism is. You don't have to know it, but one of the few beliefs of communism is first that there'll be no more private property. Okay, so everyone does not own something. You cannot own a company. You cannot own a farm. It all belongs to the government. And the government says that we should get rid of all inequality by distributing resources equally to everyone. Okay, so that's like just the general overview of what communism is. If you want to learn more, join History in Sec 3. Okay, but what you do need to know is that after war, communism started to become very influential in Malaya and Singapore. So after the war, communist parties started trying to end British rule and establish communist governments in Malaya and Singapore. Okay, so what the communists do is they fought a guerrilla war against the British during the Malayan emergency. Important phrase, from 1948 to 1960. Okay, what is a guerrilla war? It's not a war between gorillas. Okay, it's a guerrilla war. Anyone knows what a guerrilla war is? Have you ever heard of the phrase before, guerrilla war? Okay, I assume not, but basically guerrilla war, not animal war, Young. Guerrilla war is when you resort to like very sneaky ways, okay, because you're not strong enough to fight like a full-on war between them. So you do something like you sneak around, you attack their commanders, then you run away and hide again. Then you suddenly emerge again, and then you attack again, and then you hide. It's quite similar to the war that Ukraine is fighting against Russia in the early days, right? They were militarily outmatched, so they just knew the country better, they knew where to hide, they attack, and they immediately run away. Okay, that's what a guerrilla war is. Okay, so the communists began to fight a guerrilla war against the British in Malaya, in the jungles of Malaya, and this was called the Malayan Emergency. Okay, so these are pictures of Australian soldiers patrolling the jungles of Malaya to find the communists who are hiding there. Okay, and within Singapore, these communists tried to influence what we call trade unions. Okay, we actually define trade union during your deck toy activity, your maze activity. A trade union is something or some organization that represents workers. So the communists began to infiltrate these trade unions and influence the trade unions by communist ideology, okay, to rebel and resist colonial rule. And they do the same thing in Chinese medium schools in Singapore, right? So they stir up anti-colonial feelings amongst the workers and the students, okay? And as a result, there were many locals who were increasingly influenced by communism's anti-colonial ideals. Okay, in particular in Singapore, the Chinese were supportive, okay? And I think this no doubt linked to the fact that China became communist, right, with Mao Zedong. And so because of their link back to the mainland, many Chinese in Singapore were also becoming more bought over by the communist ideology. So as a result of communism, more locals were beginning to be influenced to strongly resist British colonialism. Okay, so these two developments I told you. First, the weakening of colonial rule in other Asian countries, and number two, the growing influence of communism, they all lead to the same thing, which is that when the British came back, they did not receive a welcome, a hero's welcome. There were more people that were resisting them and did not want them to come back. They wanted their own independence. Okay, so these are the developments that shaped the local response. Okay, so the British knew that there was unhappiness and they therefore had to respond. Okay, and they responded in several ways that you need to know. Okay, these are all in your textbook. 5 ways. Meeting the housing challenge, addressing food shortages, managing industrial unrest, reviving the economy, and allowing local political participation. Right? So let's go to the first one, meeting housing challenges. When the British came back, they found that many people were living in overcrowded conditions, such as slums. Okay, slums are basically like a very tight collection of houses that are very poorly maintained, very poor sanitation, bad hygiene. Okay, they are all clumped together. So Singapore had quite a lot of slums in the Tiong Bahru Chinatown area, where it was all very tightly packed together. Okay, I don't know whether you heard about this group of people called the night soil workers. Anyone heard of them? Basically, last time, I'll just type it out in chat, right? Last time, you did not have toilets. So then how do you get rid of your poop? Well, every morning, somebody will come by to your house and will collect your poop in a bucket. Right? This is the sanitation back then. So you have to keep your poop in a bucket overnight, and then somebody will come the next morning and collect it. Right? These are the conditions that were around Singapore in that time. Okay, so to address this problem of overcrowding and poor living conditions, the British had established what we call the Singapore Improvement Trust. This is what is the father of HDB. And what the SIT did is they worked to introduce low-cost public housing. Yeah, I think you can write it down. Okay. Basically, what we now know today as HDBs, the British tried to introduce this after the war. And they built about 1,700 new units per year from 1947 to 1959. Okay, so this picture here, 5 points to anyone who can guess where it is. This is one. No, this is the first public housing estate in Singapore. Anyone knows where it is? I'm just going to take a break here so you all can catch up if you need to. Nope. Yes, Kate, it is Tiong Bahru. So next time when you go to Tiong Bahru, you can still see the flats there. They are now very historically important, which means they're very expensive. Okay, I think a flat there goes for $1 million at least. Okay, so because of the historical value. So yes, the British start to produce low-cost public housing. Okay, and as a result, more locals could move out of their overcrowded housing into public apartments. And this is a key phrase that I want to introduce to you. Okay, we always, whenever we talk about things like access to food, access to water, access to good housing, these things are called standard of living. Okay, standard of living. Basically, your basic standard of life. all of us have quite a high standard of living because we all have access to food, water, basic housing. So Singapore has a good standard of living. So what was the impact of British public housing? Basically increase people's standard of living. And hopefully they will have been more inclined to therefore support the British government. But the problem is that the SIT did not build enough units to meet the growing demand. Okay, and so many continue to live in overcrowded housing throughout the 1950s. You compare this to Singapore, PAP, when they came to power, okay, and they basically did many things that the British were doing before, but they did it in a much larger quantity. So PAP actually produced 10,000 new flats every year from 1960 to 1965. Okay, compare this to the British 1,700 units are not even flats. Okay, unit is like just the room. All of you live in a unit. They only produce about 1,700 a year. But for the PAP, it was 10,000 new flats every year. So it's a very drastic increase. Okay. So basically, all this is to show that the British did try to meet housing challenges, but they were not very successful because they were not building fast enough. Okay. Now moving on, the second thing the British tried to do was they tried to address food shortages. Basically, after the war, for a long period of time, I think like 1 or 2 years, there still was rationing. Right? Imagine the war has ended already, but you still need to ration your food because the global food supply hasn't recovered yet. So many people were suffering from malnutrition. So what the British did was they established people's restaurants to provide people with affordable meals. So by the end of the 1946, there were about 10 people's restaurants in Singapore where you can get a full meal for about 35 cents. Okay, don't you all wish that we can have that nowadays? 35-cent meals. So as a result, many people, locals, received social assistance to get them through the early post-war years. The food shortages decreased when the jobs returned and their wages slowly improved. So this is a success of the British response, right? This was successful. Anyone needs me to slow down? If you do, there's actually an option to share, like, I think in your reactions, you can ask me to slow down if you want to. Okay? Third thing that the British did, they tried to manage what we call industrial unrest. Industrial refers to the workers in the factories. Unrest means unsatisfaction, right? And conflict and instability. So in the industries, in the factories, amongst the workers, there were bad working conditions. There were also housing and food shortages, and it led to what we call strikes. Okay, this is a term that you also learn about in your maize activity. A strike is where you refuse to work so that you can protest against the government and you can get the change that you want. Okay, so in Singapore, there were over 300 strikes in 1947 alone, involving 70,000 workers. And you see here a picture of workers striking against the government. Most of these strikes were provoked by the trade unions. And actually, many of the original PAP members started off by being involved in the trade union. So you see in this picture, there's Lee Kuan Yew over there, and there's Devan Nair, another famous trade unionist. Eventually, he will go on to lead Singapore's biggest trade union that we know of today. What's Singapore's biggest trade union? You've definitely heard of it before. This one is very difficult. 100 points if you can guess. Singapore has the biggest trade union. Yes, Jack, NTUC, the National Trade Union Congress. Okay, so most PAP members, the OG gang, they started off in the trade union, okay, protesting for better working conditions. Okay, so what did the British do? How did they respond to trade unions? Basically, they tried to control them, right? So they passed a law that all unions have to register with the government. And they hope that if you do so, the government can monitor your membership. The government can prevent them from using funds to organize strikes. And they hope that by doing this, they can slow down the growth of anti-colonial sentiments and win more local support. Okay, go ahead and write it down. Were they successful? Also, no, right? In fact, the more they try and control, the more angry the trade unions became. Okay, so the trade unions continued to be active, and this remained an issue in the 1950s. We'll learn about it in the Hock Lee bus riots. Okay. Fourth one. How did the British develop or respond to unhappiness? They tried to rebuild the economy. So after the war ended, basically Singapore's port was destroyed. There wasn't any trade going on. So the British needed to restore Singapore as a trading port and revive industry. So they therefore got to work. They repaired the port very quickly, and the port could resume export of tin and rubber that was becoming more in demand again globally. And remember, we learned a bit about it last year, about tin and rubber. Okay. And so this actually was very successful. A lot of us, or to rephrase it, the government sometimes says that the PAP transformed Singapore from a very third world country to a first world nation. Okay, that's true to some extent. But the point I'm making is that even before the PAP came to power, Singapore was already a very bustling city. Okay, we had a lot of the economic foundations that were needed to be successful. And that was because of the British. So these are colorized photos from the 1950s and 1960s. They show that at this time already, Singapore was a very vibrant city. There's a lot of economic activity going on. Okay. And so the British were very successful in rebuilding the economy, right? Singapore's trade surpassed pre-war levels, and Singapore thrived again as an entrepot. And this meant that many people could resume their jobs and improve their standard of living. Okay. Finally, and we're going to end soon, the British tried to resolve people's unhappiness by allowing more political participation, right? So they actually hold an election in 1948 to finally give people a say in who will represent them in this law-making assembly called the Legislative Council. Okay, what does the word legislative mean? Just for us to be clear. Okay, this refers to law making, right? Writing laws. So they basically gave locals now a position in the council that will write the laws of the country. 6 positions to be exact. Okay. However, the problem was that only British subjects were allowed to vote. And that amounted to only about 200,000 people in Singapore, in a country of about 1 million. And of the 200,000, only 20,000 voted. So this was also limited, a limited response. Okay. They had hoped that allowing more participation would slow down the growth of anti-colonialism. Because locals would think, okay, the British are benevolent, meaning that they are very kind, they're very noble rulers. Okay, and they will at least be willing to work with the British because the British were opening up to more locals. But in the end, this led to even more dissatisfaction and a greater desire for self-government. All right. So to conclude this entire lesson, okay, and I'll upload the slides on, I send to you all later. Basically, the conclusion is that Britain had to deal with increasing unhappiness, okay? And this unhappiness was brought about by internal and external developments that you all need to know. Okay? And so they tried to deal with it through 5 different developments that we talked about to make success. Okay? So it'll be good for you all to note down which were more successful. Okay? Reviving the economy was successful. Okay, also addressing food shortages was successful, but it was a limited success. In the end, the British could not slow down people's desire for independence. It only increased. Okay, and that's something that we'll talk about in future lessons. Okay, so what happens from here? I'm going to share with all of you a SLS lesson. Okay, it is compulsory that we all do it. This SLS lesson will be about the different riots that happen in Singapore. Okay, and these riots really show and demonstrate how the British response didn't work. And more people were becoming very unhappy with British rule, and they were beginning to reject colonialism. So you're going to learn about the riots through this SLS lesson. I don't think I have time to cover it in class because you have only 2 more weeks before a mid-year exam. So that's why the only lesson that you all have for the riots will be online through SLS. Okay, I won't do it in class. So all of us need to do it. We need to be independent. All right. And then after y'all do the SLS lesson on the various riots, then I'll briefly talk about how Singapore eventually got British to agree that they will give us full self-government. Okay, so the road towards self-government. And that will bring us to the end of chapter 7. Okay, so just a final reminder that the whole of chapter 6 and 7 will be tested for your mid-year examinations. Okay, meaning that any of the content from 6 and 7 can appear in your structured essay question. Okay, and in terms of the source-based questions, it will be from chapter 7. Okay, so the source-based question will be from chapter 7, not chapter 6. The essay question will be from both chapter 6 and chapter 7. All right, so with this, any questions you want to ask me, you all can type out in the chat now, or you can unmute and ask. All right, if not, it has been about 40 minutes. Okay, so we made good time. I will share with you guys this lesson on YouTube and I'll give you all the link. All right, if not, thanks all for coming today. You may leave the room.